New Zealand, an island country in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, has about 3.5 million people in total. It is made up of the North Island and the South Island, and more than 700 smaller islands, with a total land area of over 100,000 square miles. New Zealand is approximately 1,200 miles east of Australia across the Tasman Sea, and 600 miles south of the islands of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Tonga, which are all located in the Pacific Ocean. The country's diverse landscape and jagged mountain peaks, such as the Southern Alps, are mainly due to the tectonic uplift and volcanic eruptions which have shaped the landscape. The capital city is Wellington, while the city with the most people is Auckland. Given their isolation, the islands of New Zealand were the last sizable, habitable landmass to be settled by humans, supposedly. Polynesians began settling in the islands sometime right around 1280 and 1350 AD, and over time, they developed this very distinctive culture that is still very evident today. When the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman arrived in New Zealand right around 1642, he made history as the first ever European to see and record the country. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 by representatives of the United Kingdom and chiefs, established British sovereignty over the islands and British rule in the Pacific. Following its incorporation into the British Empire in 1841, New Zealand was elevated to the status of a dominion in 1907. It achieved complete statutory independence in 1947, with the British monarch serving as the head of state. With a population of around 5.1 million people, Europeans constitute most of New Zealand's population. Indigenous Maori constitutes the most significant minority, followed by Asians and people from Pacific Islands. And as a result, New Zealand's culture is primarily derived from Maori and early British settlers, with a recent broadening of culture resulting from increased immigration. New Zealand is a multilingual country, with official languages including English, Maori, and New Zealand Sign Language, with the English being the most widely spoken. Given the diverse mix of cultures, long history, and remoteness of the country, New Zealand is home to a slew of intriguing and perplexing mysteries that continue to bewilder and intrigue people to this very day. The CREWE murders took New Zealand by storm in the early 1970s. Several years earlier, Jeanette CREWE's father, Leonard M. Demler, had been fined for $10,000 for tax evasion and forced to sell a half interest in the family farm to his wife to satisfy the debt. In Auckland, Jeanette tied the knot with her husband, David Harvey CREWE. The CREWEs and their 1.5-year-old daughter were living on their farm near Pukekawa in 1970. Jeanette was terrified to be alone in the house after a series of bizarre burglaries and arson attempts, including one in which clothes were set ablaze in a bedroom. This all left her feeling unsafe. At the time, Jeanette was on the verge of inheriting her mother's half-interest in the Demler farm adjacent to the CREWE's property. Initially, the endowment was given to Jeanette because her sister had been removed from their mother's will. Demler had removed Jeanette as a beneficiary of his own will as a form of retaliation, even though she had played no role in the original matter. Jeanette's mother had then rewritten her will to give Jeanette a half-interest in Demler's farm, which she owned where she lived. And on June 22, 1970, Len Demler visited the farmstead kept by his daughter Jeanette and her husband Harvey CREWE. Although there were no signs of the couple, there was a lot of blood. And a few minutes later, Demler had heard the sounds of his 18-year-old daughter coming out of her bedroom. He dashed to her and found her hungry and filthy, but otherwise unharmed. He would later go on to discover Jeanette's body, wrapped in a bedspread, floating nearby in the river. Nearly 1 month after the murders took place, it looked like that her body might have been weighed down initially. Harvey was discovered in the same river, tangled in weeds about a mile away, only a few weeks after he was reported missing. It was then that police detained Arthur Allen Thomas, who was a local farmer well known to the CREWEs, on the suspicion that he was obsessed with Jeanette. In the end, Thomas was found guilty and sentenced to 9 years in prison. After his release, a Royal Commission of Inquiry determined that a spent cartridge allegedly linking Thomas to the slaying had been placed by 2 police officers to ensure a guilty verdict for Thomas. He was later compensated with the $950,000 for the time he had spent in prison and for the loss of his farming business. The assailant or assailants have never been apprehended to this day, and on the other hand, The evidence appears to indicate that they were familiar with the CREWE property and the surrounding area. So whoever got to these people has gotten away with it for more than 50 years and is still apparently on the loose. When a strange light appeared in the night sky on December 21st, 1979, a safe air flight south from New Zealand's capital city, Wellington, was only a few minutes into their trip. The 6 people on board, 2 pilots and 4 passengers, all witnessed the occurrence. David Crockett, a freelance cameraman, happened to be on board the tiny plane that night. Crockett had snatched his camera and began filming the mysterious light. The light could only be seen once more on the return trip later that evening. Furthermore, it was picked up by the plane's radar, which then indicated something in the sky approximately 18 miles from the aircraft. The pilots steered the aircraft towards the flying object, and it appeared to react by moving in the opposite direction. A few days later, a film crew had attempted to capture the light and successfully secured multiple lights for several minutes on camera. In a later interview, journalist Quentin Fogarty stated that they had been mesmerized by this mysterious phenomenon. We saw this string of lights, which began as a small pinpoint of light and grew into this large, pulsating globe with tinges of orange and red, according to the witness's description. After this event, it was discovered the object emitting the light was about the size of a house. A few possible explanations for these strange lights, including the presence of Venus or Jupiter, had brightly illuminated the Japanese squid boats off the coast. Some speculated that it was light reflected from cabbage fields below. However, it isn't easy to comprehend how these events would come to be on the radar. During a mackerel hunt 25 miles off the coast in Christchurch in April 1977, the Japanese fishing vessel ZUIYO-MARU noticed they had something rather large caught in its nets. When they reeled in their catch, they found this enormous rotting carcass that had become entangled with their fishing equipment. Approximately just about 4,000 pounds of rotting remains were hoisted up onto the ship and measured at about 33 feet in length. A crew member with some biology and research methodology training sketched the strange, stinking hulk and took several photographs. Yano also had the foresight to collect several tissue samples from the creature before it was thrown back into the sea to avoid spoiling the remainder of their catch. A team of scientists from the Science Museum of Tokyo looked into the evidence they had gathered. They unanimously determined that the animal was indeed a plesiosaur. According to the findings, this sizable marine reptile lived during the Jurassic period and is believed to have gone extinct approximately 65 million years ago. The report had this to say verbatim: "The surface of the body was whitish and covered with dermal fibers which intersected each other like in whales and other mammals, but were not weak as in fish. They were thick, white, fat-like tissues on the back, and reddish muscles ran longitudinally beneath the white tissues. The putrefactive smell was not like that of fishes or sharks, but resembled that of marine mammals. The head was said to have been hard and not shark-like. The carcass had nares at the front end of what remained of the skull. Following an in-depth investigation, French scientists concluded that the creature was not an early aquatic reptile, but rather the decaying remnants of a basking shark, a species native to the area with calmer waters further south from where the catch was made. Even though the photographs and sketch appear to show a creature with a long neck, a small head, and no dorsal fin, the researchers hypothesized that this was due to the decomposition of the carcass and predation. However, there are no nostrils on the front of a basking shark's head, and they do not have any red meat or white fat on their bodies. To further question the basking shark theory, the carcasses of other dead sharks washed up on the shore, but this particular carcass was discovered 30 miles off the coast of Christchurch, where it had surfaced from the bottom of the depths of around 900 feet. According to the research, the organic structure of the fibers in the tissue sample served as the primary evidence in support of the basking shark's identification. They were found to be identical to a form of collagen isolated from shark fins from a basking shark. And on the other hand, sharks do not contain any fibers in their own right that would fit this specification. Was this mysterious carcass that of a dead and decomposing shark, or an ancient sea beast that has remained hidden from human eyes? Could there possibly have been some sort of wild conspiracy to cover up the truth? The sea will likely to continue to hold the answer for some time due to lost biological samples, leaving modern technology and techniques unable to be administered. A patch of tea tree scrub on Bert O'Neill's farm in NGATEA, a small settlement in New Zealand's North Island, was strangely affected on September 4th, 1968, by a mysterious disease. He was taken aback when discovered a perfectly circular patch of dead, silvery white brush amid otherwise lush and green native bushland. O'Neill found 3 strange, deep V-shaped indentations in the ground near the center of the circle, which were arranged like the points of a triangle on the ground. The news of the unusual discovery spread very quickly, and unfortunately, nearly 1,000 curious onlookers had descended upon the location. Tourists and souvenir hunters trampling over the strange markings on the ground, destroying much of the vegetation. This transpired before they could be properly analyzed by university researchers who had arrived 5 weeks after the initial discovery of the anomaly, and they were too late to conduct their investigation. Now, according to news reports from around the island, more and more reports of similar circles appearing from various locations, prompting headlines such as, "Is Mars now looking at us?" The authorities were scrambling to find an explanation for the occurrence, with multiple hypotheses were advanced, including defoliant sprayed from an aircraft and plants ravaged by fungal growth. They claimed that rabbits or even wild pigs had carved out indentations in the ground to make nesting sites, but it doesn't really make sense, because it has been estimated that approximately 20 tons of pressure would have to have been applied in the ground for these cuts as deep as these were. The NGATEA Circle is still the most well-known of the bizarre mystery circle events in the 1970s, and like the UFO sighting hysteria of the time, it eventually faded from the news and into the collective consciousness. Frances Marshall, who was around 43 years old at the time, reportedly left home she shared with her husband in Freeman's Bay on the evening of September 28, 1914, right at approximately 7:30 p.m. to visit friends in the area. Now, following a visit to a female friend's home on Wellesley Street, Frances stopped by a shop on Hobson Street around 9:50 to chat with another lady, mentioning that she was on her way back home. The following morning, a resident had discovered her body lying on her back in a small passageway between 2 properties off Upper Nelson Street. Her body had been badly mangled and injured. It was speculated that her assailant may have gotten her. It was not considered a robbery because her handbag was discovered under her body, containing money worth around $40 in today's money. Even though her clothes were described as a little disorganized, her small blue hat remained on her head. She did not appear to have any apparent defensive wounds, but given the narrowness of the passageway, it is possible that there was not much room for a struggle to take place. Because Frances was discovered lying on her back in a secluded area, and her rumored work as a prostitute, it's possible she engaged in misconduct before the attack. However, her assailant could have forced her into that position as well. One witness claimed that she actually saw Frances in the company of an unidentified man as she walked down the street toward the scene at about 10 p.m. The heinous crime was compared to the infamous Jack the Ripper serial killings in London via local news report. Frances was allegedly working as a prostitute that evening, according to police records, although Marshall vehemently denied this assertion. Although he denied having anything to do with the murder, he did admit that he had hit her from time to time. After much deliberation, the coroner concluded that Frederick was not responsible for her death and that an unknown perpetrator most likely had done it. The murder of Frances Marshall has remained unsolved more than a century after it occurred. Many cultures all around the world have stories and legends about giant, hairy, ape-like creatures that roam the earth. Sasquatch, also known as Bigfoot commonly, is believed to exist in the Americas. The Yeti is a mythical creature supposedly found in the Himalayas, and Yowie is a term used in Australia. In New Zealand, they have a creature known as the MOEHAU, or Moha Man, named after the tallest peak in the mountain range where the creature was allegedly first sighted. It is considered a sacred site by the Maori, and is said to be a place where all kinds of mythical creatures can be found. The Maori people described the MOEHAU as terrible creatures that were half man, half animal, with an extremely aggressive temperament. They were more than willing to massacre and devour anyone who strayed into their area. The MOEHAU also has many other various names. When European colonists began to scatter across the island nation in the late 1800s, the stories of the MOEHAU man began to circulate among the locals. Some people claim they were startled by large, hairy, human-like creatures deep in the native bush, which was their report's extent. Then came more ominous reports of settlers being maimed and killed, which fueled the fear even more. Early encounters frequently would describe these creatures as aggressive and hurling rocks to scare off those who would approach them. The discovery of a headless and partially devoured body of a prospector in the Martha Mine region in 1882, as well as the discovery of a corpse of a woman in the foothills of the Coromandel Ranges in 1883, when it was revealed she had been pulled from the hovel in which she lived while the rest of her family was away, and her neck had been completely snapped. These were all thought to be the work of these creatures. According to 2 witnesses, hikers in a nearby lake area claimed to have encountered 7 of the creatures who were dressed in what appeared to be cowhides back in 83. They estimated that one of the adult males in the group stood at approximately 6 feet in height. They stood in a hidden location in the forest for several moments, watching the group walk along a rock-strewn stream before vanishing into the woods themselves. As part of this research into the MOEHAU man, Australian Yowie expert Rex Gilroy traveled to New Zealand to personally investigate this legend himself. He hoped to gather good anecdotal evidence as well as possible physical evidence. Gilroy claimed to have discovered large hominid footprints on a remote forest track in the Urewera National Park located on New Zealand's southern island. He proudly displayed his 2 plaster cast molds in front of a captivated audience of eager reporters. For the time being, until there is some sort of definitive proof from perhaps a more trustworthy source, the MOEHAU man will be treated in the same way as its hairy brethren, the Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Skunk Ape, Yeti, just remembered as a story and a myth, until we have more concrete evidence to show for it. The MV JOYITA was a 69-foot wooden ship built by the Wilmington Boat Works in Los Angeles in 1931 as a luxury yacht for movie director Roland West, who named the ship after his wife and actress Gem Carmen Joyita, which I'm actually saying it incorrectly. In Spanish, it would actually be Joyita, and it means jewel or small gem. Milton E. Beacon bought the ship in 1936, registering it, and during this time, she traveled south to Mexico and San Francisco for the 1939 to 1940 Golden Gate International Exposition. Chester Mills was the ship's captain for a while during this period. The ship was then purchased by the U.S. Navy in October of 1941, soon before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and sent to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where she was equipped as a yard patrol boat YP-108. Until the end of World War II, the Navy had utilized her to monitor the Big Island of Hawaii. She ran around in 1943 and was severely damaged, but the Navy desperately needed ships, so she was restored. The ship was declared surplus to Navy needs in 1946, and most of her equipment was removed. The Louis brothers purchased this ship in 1948, followed by William, who purchased the boat in 1950, but he did not need it, so he sold it in 1952 to a professor at the University of Hawaii. The boat had set out from the harbor in Samoa at around 5 in the morning on October 3, 1955, destined for the Ko'olua Islands, about 270 miles away. The boat was supposed to sail at noon the day before, but her departure was postponed due to a failure of the port engine clutch. The boat was unable to leave Samoa on one engine in the end. A government official, a doctor on his way to conduct an amputation, a coconut buyer, and 2 children were among the 16 crew members and 9 passengers on board. Medical supplies, lumber, 80 empty 45-gallon oil drums, and other miscellaneous groceries had made up her load. It was estimated that the journey would take anywhere between 41 and 48 hours in total. On October 5th, the boat was due to arrive to the islands, and the ship was overdue, according to a notice from a port on October 6th. The crew did not send a distress signal to any ship or land-based operator, and so a search and rescue campaign was initiated, and Sunderlands of the Royal New Zealand Air Force scoured a probable area of probably around 100,000 square miles of the ocean from October 6th to October 12th. Still, there was no evidence of the boat or her passengers or crew. And finally, on November 10th, Gerald Douglas, captain of the merchant ship, he had spotted the boat drifting north more than 600 miles west of her secluded pathway to where she was originally supposed to go. The ship was partially flooded and leaning dramatically, but no sign of the passengers or crew could be found, and the 4 tons of cargo were also gone. According to the rescue team, the radio was recovered and tuned to around 2,182 kilohertz, the International Marine Radio Telephone Distress Channel. There was still fuel in the tanks, and based on the amount consumed, she had traveled about 243 miles before being abandoned, most likely within 50 miles of her final destination. The leak most likely began after 9 p.m. on the second night of the cruise. Even though her hull was sound, and even though the lower decks were flooded, examiners learned of water flowing into the yacht while she was tied back in the harbor. A pipe in the engine's cooling system's raw water circuit had failed due to galvanic corrosion, allowing water to enter in. The crew would have first noticed the leak when the water level reached past the engine room floors, at which point it would have been nearly impossible to find the source. Furthermore, the pumps were not equipped with filters and had grown clogged with debris, making pumping water out extremely difficult. The ship was then restored and put back into duty as a cargo ship after the wreck, which was disturbing. After running around on a reef, though, it was finally labeled an unlucky ship. It had been stripped and dismantled, and the fate of those unfortunate individuals on board still remains a mystery. The search for a plane that went missing between Christchurch and Milford Sound continues nearly 60 years later in the rugged mountainous regions of New Zealand's South Island. To this day, groups of searchers are still looking for the wreckage. During a scenic flight on February 12, 1962, pilot Brian Chadwick's Dragonfly went missing with 5 passengers on board, and the cause has never been determined. Authorities launched one of the largest aerial searches in New Zealand history after the plane failed to return, but the plane was never found. Investigator Bobby Reeves said discovering a woman's boot in a remote mountain location had led them to believe the plane was about 8,000 feet above sea level and buried beneath a blanket of perpetual snow. What led them to the snow theory was the boot was not covered in moss, which it should have been if it had been in the bush the whole time. Continuing the search in that area was also deemed too dangerous, as searchers had fallen down the side of a mountain multiple times, and so the search continues on to this day. The moa was a large flightless bird that lived on the islands of New Zealand and is considered to be extinct. These birds resembled a colossal version of the emu in appearance. In contrast to ostriches, emus, and other large flightless birds, moas did not have any wings at all, unlike their counterparts. Moas were found on all of New Zealand's islands, and there were 9 different species in total, with the largest being about 12 feet tall, weighing more than 500 pounds. It is important to note that not all different species were quite as massive, with some species being about the size of a modern-day flightless bird. These birds had a body shape similar to that of an emu, with long necks and long legs, but according to researchers, they walked with their necks stretched out in front of them rather than walking completely upright. With several different moa species, each of them inhabited a different ecosystem and habitat. In addition to beech forest, some species lived in shrublands, subalpine regions, coastal regions, and other various habitats. They lived both at sea level and higher up in the mountain regions of the island. Now, according to researchers, they are believed to have gone extinct around 1400 BC, though some believe these birds never truly went extinct. Whalers and sealers reported unconfirmed sightings of moa as far back as the 18th and even 19th centuries, but there was no real way to confirm them. In 1876, a young girl by the name of Alice Mackenzie lived in Martins Bay, right about 18 miles north of Milford Sound. She was the very first ever to report seeing a possible surviving moa in the area. During a walk along the beach's bush line, when she was about 7, she claimed to have come across a very large bird with blue coloration that was calmly squatting among some bush. She claimed that she had been able to get close enough to the creature's rump feathers, but when she attempted to catch it by tying it up, the creature had responded with a harsh grunting cry and stood to its full stature. It was described as being taller than she was, without a tail and with limbs as big as her arms, and this imposing bird went about chasing her away aggressively. The fact that the girl had previously been unaware of the existence of the moa and had written about the encounter matter-of-factly in her diary indicates that this was not made up. The sighting is considered reasonable, and one of the more recent sightings in this supposedly extinct bird was when Patty Freeney, Sam Wabi, and Rochelle Rafferty were trekking in the Craigieburn mountain range, which is part of the Southern Alps on New Zealand's South Island. And on January 20th, 1993, Rainier, an experienced mountaineer, observed a gigantic bird lurking in the bushes, roughly 6 feet tall with reddish brown and gray feathers that stopped at the bird's knees. He excitedly pointed at it to his buddies, and they all looked intently. The animal supposedly became terrified and began to flee, with Rainier, who was taken aback by what he saw, had the foresight to get his camera ready before chasing it down and capturing a snap of the fleeting bird, which also left wet footprints in the dirt. The shot was highly contested after it was photographed, examined, and considered the first photographic evidence supporting the supposed surviving existence of MOAs. Rainier's testimony was taken seriously because he was a respected member of his community, a seasoned mountaineer, and a former British elite SAS squad member. The expert examination has led to the blurry and out-of-focus image not being noticeably faked and appearing to be of an actual large bird of some type. Nonetheless, there has been suspicion directed at the photograph, claiming that the bird's long neck is too broad to be that of a moa and that it is a red deer. Rainier had spent the rest of his life combing the region for more proof of the bird he felt he had seen, and surprisingly, just a few months after his initial claim, it was discovered that 2 unconnected German hikers had written in a hiker's logbook about seeing a moa in the same spot, giving the report a little more credibility. What do you guys think? Are there really strange and mysterious creatures we don't know about living in the islands of New Zealand? Or are many of these sightings just fabrications and misidentifications? I'll let you decide. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to go ahead and smack that like button. And if you enjoy this channel, be sure to go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and keep your notifications turned on, so that way YouTube will let you know every time I release a great new video. As always, guys, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I will see you guys in the next video.